these are... Okay. I guess, do we have... Is this off now or is on? Test, test, 1, 2.
Welcome, everyone. I think the previous panel spilt over a little bit, so I'm going to give it another 30 seconds just for people to filter in and settle down. Of course, this is going online as well, so once we get started, we will have an audience in the room and an audience across the world, hopefully. This is a good time as any to just run a quick round of housekeeping announcements. It would be great if you could keep your phones on silent through the conversation. At the end, I'm definitely going to have time for questions. And if you raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you and the question can be posed then. Do try and keep your questions brief so that we can get in as much perspective as possible. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Thank you for joining in. At 5 p.m., I realize it's us that's between you and your evening drink. So I appreciate the fact that you're all in the room today. But I think this panel is fitting because for me, at least, it's a conversation that makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful for a couple of reasons. One, the fact that this year at the festival, it's been amazing to see so many conversations around climate. I'm really happy it's not a fringe event anymore, and it's really front and center of any discussion really of what's happening with news and with reportage. The other thing that makes me hopeful is the fact that there are so many people here doing such fantastic work, whether it's within newsrooms or without them, around building communities for journalists. And the third thing that makes me hopeful is Saturday evening, because it's different from Monday evening. So this is a good time as any. And by the way, for our audience joining virtually as well, Eid Mubarak to everyone who's celebrating. So let's get straight into it. Maybe I will take a second just to contextualize who I am and what we do, and then I'll introduce our really fabulous panel. My name is Mithali Mukherjee. I'm Director of Programs at Reuters, and what I lead, which is why I'm here having this discussion, is our newest baby called the Oxford Climate Network. This was born a year back, already has has almost 300 journalists within our community. At any given point in time, we scan about 97 to 98 countries in terms of the faces we have. So from the Pacific Islands to everywhere in Africa to Malaysia, Nepal, we really love that bit. We are consciously online only, which is how we've been able to get that kind of spectrum and that kind of diversity. And I think we really love what we do, and we love the community that we've built, which I think might be the case for everyone who's gathered here for this chat. So let me do quick introductions. Gustavo Falleris is an environmental investigations editor at the Pulitzer Center. He's led programs for the Earth Journalism Network. He founded a collaborative geojournalism platform, and now, of course, he works at Pulitzer as coordinator of the Rainforest Investigation Network. Jessica Davis is Senior Director of Data Initiatives and News Automation at USA Today. She leads a team that's changing the way weather and trends are being reported. And she's also a member of the Oxford Climate Network, Cohort 2. And Katharina Kropshofer is a founder of the Austrian Climate Journalism Network, one of the 3 established national climate journalism networks in Europe. She's been doing what I can safely say is the very hard work of community building and really keeping connections going between journalists. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining in. Let's do a little bit of brass tacks first in terms of why these kind of networks are important and why they're important for climate journalists. So maybe we'll work our way from the end of the table up here. Gustavo, you want to go first?
Thank you, Mitali, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a very fascinating question because that's something that I think a lot about what I like to say, the scale of the climate problem and how networks helped us to tackle it. Being very direct, I think it's impossible to do a comprehensive coverage of climate change without a network approach. And that's basically because to do a good climate story, it's not going to be one story. And it's not going to be one story in one point of time and not one point on Earth. I think for doing a comprehensive coverage, we'll need, of course, a lot of stories in different geographies and over time. I like to say sometimes when I'm doing a workshop that the good thing about being a climate journalist is for sure you have jobs at least for the next 50 years, maybe 100 years. You know, like if you want to cover the climate.
Are you happy? No. Are you working?
Well,
yes.
In kind of an economic perspective, if you're covering the Paris Agreement, you certainly will cover until 2050 at least. And if you want to do like a global view, you need to know, like to have a story maybe in Brazil, maybe in the US, maybe in other countries to do this. I was saying like a comprehensive coverage. So in that sense, I think networks, a network approach is the only way of doing it, really, for covering a comprehensible geographical scale and temporal scale. Like when I say temporal scale, I usually say like to do several stories about the same subject over time. For example, my beat is deforestation. I cannot do one story of deforestation saying that I'm doing a good job. I'll have to do deforestation every year to know how it's evolving. Are you covering the ice sheet of the Greenland? You probably have to do it over the next 10 years, several stories over the year. And another thing is to kind of tune your coverage according to the pulse of the Earth. You know, like I'm not doing a story because some politicians are talking about floods or droughts. It's because I understand how the Earth system works, and I'm tuning my coverage according to these variations of the nature, basically, of how climate is affecting. So I think the network allows us to do this. That's why I think it's so important.
Jessica, I might sort of tweak my question a little bit to you, which is why did you choose to be a part of a network that talks about, you know, journalism in a climate context?
Absolutely. Let me turn my mic on. So for me, networks are really important to me. I started as a reporter out west in California, and I was on the front lines of wildfires and disaster after disaster. I felt the heat right on my face as I was,
literally,
you know, and fled my home at times. That's where I grew up. As a reporter out west, I remember moments in my early career where I reached out for help covering fires for days on end without sleep. there was no help because people weren't yet thinking about the scale of those fires, right? This is several decades ago, not to age myself. And so really what, from that moment vowed, no journalist I work with will be alone. I will always volunteer to help with coverage no matter what organization I'm in. Fast forward a few years, I led a team of journalists and made good on that vow that we developed structures and systems around disaster coverage. Fast forward a little bit more, my career now is taking me to finding tools and solutions to free up journalists' time. And I knew that I had gaps in my personal knowledge. I'm not a climate journalist, right? And so I was very clear about that in my application, and I felt so welcomed by this network community. And I'm absolutely an embodiment of what you said. This is not fringe anymore, right? But climate is such an important part of our daily lives, right? That I knew that this was an important thing that needs to be embedded in our news products, in our coverage. It's not just a niche thing. And so that's what propelled me to sign up for the network, and I was pleased to be accepted in the second cohort. And it's just been such a blessing for my learning journey, even though, right, I'm not a reporter but anymore, but it's just been fantastic. And I don't feel alone now on a global scale, where I started as a reporter, right, having that one moment, never again if we can help it.
I'm really glad to hear that, and I just want to sort of pause before I turn to you to say, at least for us at the Climate Network, we're quite consciously looking for journalists that have not covered climate. We understand the importance of someone who has expertise and depth, but really for us, it's sort of, in the olden times when you would go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked and there was one lens and the other and then one really fit, it's kind of like that. So whether you're covering business or lifestyle or sport, we think climate it's something you need to slide in there, and you need to have enough background to understand what the climate element is that fits into your story. For you, it was the conscious effort of building a community. Why did you feel that need?
To be completely honest, it was, for me, it was a moment of frustration. And it was really sharing this with some other, I was working as a freelancer back then, and I worked for a weekly newspaper in Austria. But back then it was really feeling like, okay, whenever I pitch this, there's a bit of a misunderstanding of the importance and the sheer scale of this problem. So when we first started our network, it was a bit of a self-help group. Where we could, share these frustrations of pitching, but also like working on the stories and kind of the political scale that was missing. That quickly, gladly turned into a motivation when we realized, there's a momentum for this, and there's a lot of people that are feeling the same way, and it's not just, I feel like there's lone warriors in every news organization that have realized the importance of this topic, and also, as we've heard, the positive sides of this, there will be jobs in this for a long time, and there's so many stories that can be told. And from realizing this, we quickly grew, and the resonance we got so quickly really showed us we were onto something. And also, we had a bit of imposter syndrome of like, why can we as very young journalists just found something like this, but if nobody else did it, then why not? And this is how we started, how we grew. The nice thing was that through our network, people that were working at the same organization found each other. Very often they were like, okay, there's another person from my medium. Those are the bigger newsrooms, of course, that also thinks the same way. Let's, get together, let's go to our editor and see how we can introduce some structures that would really make a difference.
It's a good time to do a bit of a dipstick survey. I don't know if this room is very representative of it, but how many folks in the room at this point are part of newsrooms or work with a particular news platform? If you could just indicate with a show of hands. And how many of you have an editor, any editor who sort of handles climate and you can go to understand what a climate story might mean? Okay. I know my research colleagues at Reuters will hang me out to dry for doing such badly researched data, but that doesn't look like a good figure. Gustavo, is that part of the problem also for journalists who want to understand climate, which is that they're not getting the help they need within the newsroom, which is when networks like this become really important?
True. I think there is a lack of understanding in a lot of newsrooms on the scale of the problem. It's not just about doing a coverage of one conference or like creating the beat. It's something that is happening in major newsrooms. Luckily now, you have like the climate desk of the New York Times, or you have like climate correspondents. Now in AP has created a massive program of climate correspondents. But if we look at the importance of the climate issue in a local level, we know that's not happening. And because of resources, we're not going to blame the editors or the owners or the publishers directly. I think it's a transition that will need to happen, like for creating beats inside. So the networks certainly are an opportunity. I launched, let's say, my career as a climate journalist because I got an opportunity for a fellowship with the Earth Journalist Network, and that changed my career. So that, in a sense, I see the examples that we're seeing here, or the network, the Oxford network, as first as an individual impact. Like the person becomes an ambassador of the issue, not an activist, please, but like an ambassador of climate journalists. So that's a first impact. And then who knows, you have like the organizational impact, the outlets start to change from inside. And I think the networks helps in this different level of impacts, and who knows, we can get to the real impact in the society by doing the journalism. The example that we have with the Rainforest Investigations Network, it's even more specific because we helping journalists to make this connection in a very concrete way. What is the relationship between the rainforest and climate? Because you get a lot of reportings like, we need to save the Amazon because otherwise everybody's gonna die. True, but why? And then becomes the problem. Where's the data that proves that? Like, we all need to be concerned about the Amazon. Why? Where's the data? So the network is for us to exchange the ways of telling the story, to find the data and define the methods for doing really concrete stories that matter in a local and a global level.
Yeah. Which sort of raises a more technical question, perhaps, Katerina, which is, how would you describe the importance of a formalized network, which, sort of comprises members who've made a conscious decision to join it, versus a more spontaneous or informal collaboration? What do you see as the power of a more formalized network?
I mean, most of us in the network, we're not in leading positions. Most of us are reporters. So what we can do by this, and this might sound corny, but like if you have the backing of 50 other journalists that also stand behind the same principles, you can go to your editor, you can go to conferences, you can spread the word about what you're doing, and really feel like there's more people behind me, and we can exchange this knowledge. Whereas before I already did that, but I feel like I didn't get where I needed to go. And when I say this, I mean, we heard this as well. It's not, climate change is not just a single story that you pitch. I mean, that as well, but we always say it's a dimension of everything. And what you said before as well, it means that every reporter, it doesn't matter on which desk or for which beat you're working, has to have a basic understanding, just like human rights or democracy. It's like a literacy that everybody should have. And I think that's why, having communities like this, also the Oxford network, can set this basic level of understanding of this dimension, of this big thing that we're talking about. And yeah, it just makes you stronger when you move forward.
Jessica, you're in a unique position where you made the conscious choice to understand climate better, and then you had the opportunity to go into a newsroom and effect change with it. What did you find? Say good things. Make us hopeful.
You know what? Anytime we learn something, we get really excited. And at with the network, we talked about be smart about how you bring change back to your newsroom, because you're more excited and they don't understand your why behind why you're so excited about that. So I really thought through that and tried to find, I really took away climate attribution as very actionable now, right? Climate impacts are happening now. So what does that mean for our coverage? How is our audience engaging at USA Today and our 200 plus local newsrooms in our network across the US from coast to coast? And what is the opportunity there, with my role of using automation and AI tools to help our journalists tell their stories better. And really what I found was, okay, we are a subscription model. And so that means that building habit with our readers means publishing a story about the weather happening daily, weekly, monthly in context was something that I saw was the biggest opportunity that we could help our journalists, not replace them, but help them do that more consistently. So the earliest one, and we just went live at the Arizona Republic, so we're starting small. What we're doing is we automated severe weather alerts for that community. We have the infrastructure in place to publish that across our network. We're going slowly because these are automation tools, but it's all built out and ready to go. And so they're testing it for us, and we put context in that reporting. And so the tools that we're using allow us to template. It's going to start there. Eventually, I do want to layer in even more attribution. And so that's where I've built the roadmap out of what that progression will look like. But I'm making sure that our journalists and our reporters inform what those stories look like, making sure our audience response is what we need it to be. But it's been very early days, but it's been very positive because when you're there for people more regularly, at least daily, weekly, they're more likely to turn to you. I think local TV journalism does this very well, yeah. Right, with their meteorologists. And so for our network of local newspapers, we have to be there, right, and explaining this is what's happening. And you're seeing more, you're having a severe, like a flood warning now, but you've had more flood warnings in the last 5 years than you've ever had before. That's a really simple statement. We have all the data. There's tons of open data in the US that we've scraped and automated and cleaned. And so putting that in context isn't as hard. And none of our journalists are alone, even if they don't have data expertise, in being able to tap into that tool, into that framework. So, if this panel was just a few months further into this year, we probably would be publishing in more markets. But I'm a big believer in, testing small and then scaling.
Yeah. No, I think that's an amazing point that you make about the importance of local journalism. Just as an example, when the devastating floods happened in Pakistan, there was so much that came out by way of global reportage at that point, but it was the local reporters that were really going to the regions that were the most difficult to reach and talking about what was happening there, both in terms of socio-economic distress and otherwise. What's interesting, though, is that the feedback we got from a lot of journalists there was that I don't know enough, and my newsroom can't support me to contextualize this story the way I should. So the tilt often, say, for example, in a newsroom in Pakistan, is about how the establishment has failed the people, which it well may have, but where's the support for these journalists to understand it in a climate context? When we were chatting yesterday, though, Gustavo, you were talking about this local and global collaboration and how networks are really important in terms of doing that. I'd love for you to share an example of a story where that happened for climate journals.
Yeah, sure. I have several stories, but if you allow me, I just want to say a word of enthusiasm for what I just heard from Jessica, because I really believe in what she just said. I think that the role that we're going to play on providing a service on simply distributing data and then adding the layer of context, which is the best value that journalists provide, is fantastic. I mean, that's what I really believe that we can do. We've seen a lot of dashboards of journalists in the last few years, like this kind of putting together a lot of data in the same place, but the fact that automation allows us to start distributing alerts, it makes me really hopeful of the role that journalists will have on helping people to not suffer too much with the climate change, basically, and I think we have this role, really. So I wanted to say that I was super excited when I heard that. But the examples that we have a lot of, we are finding out fascinating things with this network about the rainforest, the RIN. because we knew there was like a lot of complexities on supply chains. So one supply chain that we work a lot with the TBIJ, the editor Robert is here, is my great partner. It's on food systems, for example. We know that the beef supply chain connects the entire world. You know, like the cattle that's being raised in Colombia and Brazil is reaching Egypt, Russia, China, US. The companies are global. And the only way of getting to the bottom of this problem is to have a network that is global. It's like, can we work with a Russian journalist together with a Brazilian journalist and show the supply chain to like step by step really, or like gold. Gold is such a big problem nowadays. The pandemic, the price just exploded. It's a very safe asset, as everybody knows. And so there has a big rush of the less maybe reserves of gold, which are, guess what, within indigenous territories. So you have like a human rights problem, violence problem of on the ground, that you have like a very poor miners without trying to, you know, like glamorize or anything, but you have like very uneducated working class that is just up for anything on the ground, that is connected with the richest bank in the world. So it's a complex, it's a complex system. But I will talk about one story that was fascinating, again, with the colleagues of TBIJ. We recently published a story about collagen. Some of you might know about this frenzy and the rush for the beauty and wellness that collagen can provide. So it's being big in terms of propaganda in the US and well, several countries to achieve consumers. And our fellow Elisangela Mendonça did a wonderful story showing like how this massive industry that's growing so fast is linked to deforestation in Brazil. And this, again, is not a vague thing. You have to show every step with documents and everything. And it is possible to show that that farmer, that guy locally is selling to that bigger guy that sells to even a bigger guy that ends up in Nestlé. So that kind of story that needs to be really concrete, change things in a way that are more objective instead of like just a vague message that problems are linked. We're seeing complex supply chains that connect the entire world in a way.
Katerina, does that work in a national context as well, where one reporter picks up a story and says, hey, I have some bits and bobs here, but I haven't been able to add it all up. Can someone help me with it?
Yes, although I have to say that our network for now has been focused more on, you know, doing press briefings before like bigger political events like COPs and FCC reports coming out. So yes, there's people that find, you know, collaboration in our network, but I think our main goal right now is more to connect over, you know, building structures that are needed. Maybe it's Austria is a small country that is not it's not ahead of the game in this, let's say it like this, when it comes to climate reporting. And when we look at the US, there's a lot more happening, for example. So we do that, and that's our main focus, but it's definitely something that we would have the platform to do.
Jessica, what did you think were sort of, you know, what is it that you were looking for when you went into this? Because, you know, I'm conscious of the fact that so often you say a network is important, but all of you are journalists who come in with truckloads of experience. It's not like you don't know how to do your job. You know how to do your job. You're just looking to understand how this new beast sort of fits into your reportage. What is it that really helped you? Was it, you know, access to material? Was it talking to other journalists from other countries? What worked?
I mean, it's a fantastic, really well thought out program, and again, highly recommend it. And I was not prompted to say that. I really believe
No
it.
drinks
Evangelizing. Definitely apply. And I think, like, for me, I was just very much on the front lines of, you know, my teams and myself were covering disaster after disaster. And just feeling like there's more context here. And our climate journalists at USA do a fantastic job of putting those into context. But I just felt that I had my own learning journey to do, which is ongoing. And what I really appreciated is there were reading materials, there were speakers that don't just talk about the theory, they make it real. There's journalists invited to share what they're working on. There's a chance for fireside chats that are, not recorded, more off the record, safe space to talk about what you're struggling with, what you're not understanding, asking people, what do you think, what's your experience? And because it's such a global, well-represented group, like I didn't know about some of the impacts happening in other parts of the world. And, now I'm connected with those journalists and can ask them questions. Sometimes they ask me questions. And, that's not something I was looking for going into it, but it's been, an enriching part of my career since. So, going in, it was about my perceived knowledge gaps. I mean, climate's a lot. I just gonna lie. I remember talking to Kat about just like, oh, these terms, I like don't even understand them. But I felt safe to say that, and it was important to me. Like I could say attribution now. Like I know what that means, and that means saying, is it the impact of climate change or not? Just that alone, shows like, hey, this room's full of people that, do climate journalism, but it really does make it more accessible to the newsroom as a whole.
And you raised two important points, both of which I want to unpack. One is, of course, the mental health impact and trade-off here, and the other is, as you said, very skewed access to information and material. Gustavo, I mean, we found that, and perhaps you did as well. The situation for journalists in the global south is markedly different from what's happening with the global north. That's one. And the other is that if I want to report on a story within my region, I'm very often pointed again to the 4 experts sitting in a university in Northern America who are going to tell me what the problem with my region is. Is that something you experienced? As
a reporter myself, I was lucky to have good sources locally because of the deforestation issue is so present in our lives in Brazil that I didn't feel personally so much of this. But we do have some projects that we are now running in the network where we face that. And again, the network helps a lot on bringing approaches to deal with that. It could be, how to build layers of information that you combine scientific knowledge with local knowledge. A lot of the stories that are local outside of the, let's say, like the major countries where the research about climate change is happening it can sound like a criticism, but I think it is a criticism. I don't want to be specific about one story, but sometimes I feel like there is like a lot of like opinions about people who knows about the climate, but like, oh, the climate is changing. I used to plant like this, but I cannot have the same crops. I think this is, of course, these opinions are important, but not sufficient.
Yeah.
So in a way, we try in the network to create this idea that you need several layers of information. Again, coming back to the global and the local, how you combine the scientific knowledge with the local knowledge. More and more indigenous voices coming to the report to represent what climate change is. Like this knowledge, like the traditional knowledge of the territory needs to be present, for sure. That's the thing. And sometimes this is missing on the Global North reporting. So how you combine the university voice with the indigenous voice. And that can be done, like with a mix, in a very practical way of field reporting with data journalism. So these are the layers of information that I want to mean. It's like if you bring the very rigorous field reporting with a very rigorous data journalism analysis, I think you can combine these two words. And I know you bring also the perspective of you not feeling alone or I think the mental health. And in that sense, I feel that the network brings the technical knowledge, but also the knowledge for allowing people to go in key places where it's not easy to get inside. So like the security issue in the rainforest regions is real. Yeah. So what we exchange also is like security protocols. It's not only how you approach science, data journalism and traditional knowledge, but how you actually go into areas of conflict, environmental crime, and do a good reporting without putting yourself in risk. So the network in a way also helps this knowledge and security protocols to be shared and to be standard. We're creating more and more standards on how these people should do this reporting.
How are you building that? I'm curious because that's something that we're really discussing in our climate network, which is how can we best support our journalists by way of mental health support in what is often a very lonely space to be reporting and at other times a very dangerous place to be reporting. In countries like mine, for instance, even reporting sort of, slipped targets on coal usage could mean that you are instantly in the face of a storm, and this is state-sponsored machinery. How do you support your network?
Well, there are cases by cases. I think I have a recent case that I'm looking at. It's not directly from our network, but it's from a friend. And one simple thing that I'm realizing, which I realized for myself as well over the years, like we sometimes think that we are tougher than we are. We're like, okay, I'm going to see all this disaster. I'm going to interview all these bad guys. I'm going to hear all these people suffering, and I'm good. I'm just doing my story. There's a moment that will come down on you.
And then I'll have a cry in the bathroom, and then I'll come back and be brave again.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we can help people by allowing them to share and to be open about that.
Yeah.
I heard a story about war correspondents that were invited for a fellowship to deal with trauma, and they were supposed to sit in a room and chat and share experience, and they said like the first 3 days they were just in the bar, pretending that nothing needs to be talked. Like they were like, oh yeah, we're okay. But I don't think I've seen so many stuff that I don't think in the end, we'll be okay just by pretending that we are okay. So in that way, that's one simple thing that I think I learned. But in a more practical way, there's no way of doing like a field reporting without having a risk assessment, a contingency plan, like how's your network or how's your newsroom will respond if you have a problem, if you disappear, if you don't respond, so we are advising our fellows to have all like the satellite kind of coming in reach, this kind of trackers with them. It's needed. We just had a case that we proved that was totally needed, and the backup plan. If the person is harassed or disappear, the plan has to start to roll, and you have the measures to avoid the worst. The case that we have in the Amazon last year, it was really important for us to be aware that there's no more space for just go and nobody knows where you are or what you're doing or not having a contingency plan. So I think risk assessment and contingency plan are the key things.
Katerina, I imagine it's different for different contexts and communities, but what's the sort of mental health load that you're experiencing with the network you speak to, and how do you guys support each other?
I mean, just being here in the last days and having so many conversations about climate change and climate reporting makes me realize how important it is to have this platform where you can talk about the frustrations and this ongoing fight, especially knowing that, probably for the rest of my career I will be having these conversations. And what is helping me massively is also, testing my arguments, because we are under attack on so many levels. I mean, there's so many people that still label what we do as activism, which is of course not like on the same level of what you're talking, but it still is something that is discrediting the work that we are doing, because it is an important part of this job now, and we can't deny that, but yet it is still not getting the quality and quantity of what it should have, at least in Austria. And I think just knowing, like fact-checking this, how did this go for you, and sharing the story. I mean, how I normally respond, maybe I can share with you as well, is when somebody accuses us of activism, I ask, my colleagues that write on corruption, if they also want corruption to go away if they're writing about it. So I want climate change to be stopped and as many measures as possible taken against it. So this is also not activism in the same sense that writing against corruption is not necessarily activism.
Yeah, I remember a sort of friend, colleague who actually founded the Oxford Climate Network, Wolfgang Blau, and I talking about it, and I think he made an interesting point, which is that when people say, why are you interested in climate, you should respond saying, why aren't you interested in climate? You explain yourself, why should I? But Jessica, I think you made an important point at the start when you said you're starting small. And I think that's amazing because part of the mental health burden is also I'm not doing enough. My newsroom doesn't hear me. I'm not getting things done the way I'd like to. Is that important as well to sort of celebrate the small wins and the big ones?
It's the only way for me because I work with 200 plus local newsrooms and a national newsroom. So I could get paralyzed very easily, just trying to figure out where do we start, how do we do this. It also gives me the opportunity in some of our local markets where this is very politicized, where there is denial in the US about this issue. And so that's why I thought, let's just start with what's happening in the weather. Let's put it in context. That's what I took away, was like, that's really powerful. It's not maybe enough to change the world, but it's a start. And most importantly, toward the network and the bravery of the journalists that are on the front lines of this, is supporting them, right? And making sure that wherever possible, how can we use the open data, to help them so that their reporting efforts are getting the firsthand reports that really make this a human story that we know that has impact with our audience. It makes it real to them. And then the data journalism behind it, as you shared, puts it into, okay, I understand what this means for me in a way that really only data can. And so, I feel like if all I can do is just support our network of newsrooms, and I'm not alone in that. I also am working with Climate Central to make sure that their experts are available to our journalists, because what the value of automating these, weekly, daily stories is that frees up our journalists to, hey, what's the analysis? What's the deeper dive? And for some of these local newsrooms, having a resource like Climate Central where they, have a whole part of their organization that make experts available for specific US data, right? That's where, just trying to look out. And then, we also are tied in to now the Oxford Journalism Network, Climate Journalism Network. So it seems like compared to where we were even just 2 years ago, it's just, I remember my lone voice, not alone, feeling the impacts. We know in the West, right, attribution, the fires are worse because of the drought there. That's where my journey started. And if these products can help our frontline reporters, then mission accomplished for me.
Indeed, and many more to come, I'm sure. Gustavo, one is the impact that's happening at an individual level, and the other for networks like this, because often you keep getting asked why, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that you're creating an institution that can be a powerful actor and that can demand accountability when an individual voice can't. This is what happens with the power of a network. All of you stand up and say, hey, that happened at COP and that was discussed, but where's it gone? Do you believe that too?
Yeah, no, totally. And that applies for exactly the kind of investigations that we are doing. If you were also want to show the complexity of some of these issues, if you're having several outlets and individuals working together, it definitely get more attention. I think that the audiences understand that too, like that the collaborations on a publishing level are very important. So there was a lot of panels about collaborations in this conference, and I think this is reflecting the moment that we are living, that the audiences, they believe that some of these issues can only be done if outlets are collaborating as well. And the collaborations coming from the individual, they are transformative for the journalists, because they will have to change their view on competition. They will have to change their view on how to share data. They will have to share their view on how to communicate in a transparent way. So these collaborations We are very lucky at this network to work with our editor, Marina Walker, who coordinate the Panama Papers, and she has a methodology on how you should behave on a collaboration. And that's so interesting. You know, like you have to be transparent, you have to share your document, you have to share your data. So this is a transformation on an individual level. And again, for the climate issue, that's just perfect.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I have sort of a question that's two sides of the coin. And thank you for the shout out, Jessica, but I do want to also, for anyone who's listening and tuning in, we would really love to have everyone who applies at the Oxford Network to join us. We can't, I'm sorry. The last time we got 900 applications for 100 spots. So we're really trying. But what I want to do for anyone who's listening and thinking, hey, how do I do this for myself or for my community? I want to hear from the three of you, A, how you can do this if you want to, and B, because a dose of realism is always good. What's the hardest part? Let me start with you.
What's the hardest part? I start with the positive side
Go
as well.
on then.
I wanted to share like one more example of what we did, or a project that is now ending, which is kind of like a charter. We sat together and we were like, okay, what are the core principles of what constitutes good climate journalism for us? And we came up with the most basic things, like saying, you know, the urgency of this, needing the proper climate visuals. We got some scientists in to give us, you know, the sources for everything that we were saying, and we went through this process of inviting in journalists from different newsrooms, discussing every word, which was a very long process. And now we kind of have this tool that newspapers or journalists working at newspapers and outlets can use to go to their editor and be like, if you want, you know, this is like a charter, it's like scientifically backed. We got the Austrian press agency on board that says we're gonna put, you know, your logo on our homepage, and it's kind of like a stamp of approval that you can have. And it also means, you know, you get into conversation with your editor about which are the structures that you need, and it's less about changing editorial guidelines or, you know, the specifics of each outlet, but giving individual journalists that feel like they want to do something, a toolbox of reaching out and doing the first step. And this is something that everybody in every country can, you know, just copy paste. It's a very simplistic model, but it works.
Do you have a hardest part? Do you not have a hardest part?
I have what, sorry?
What's the hardest part, or is there not
What's the hardest part? I mean, I still think, you know, people in power are the ones that call the shots, and if you have someone that has not understood the urgency of this topic, then you might have a hard time. And I know that at the newspaper where I work, it was definitely not an easy ride, but we do have a climate desk now, and it's a very small publication, but it makes all the difference, because it's, you know, the kind of stuff that you can't argue anymore. Like every week there will be one story at least on, you know, biodiversity or climate change. So it gives me hope to know that, you know, you can establish these structures.
for you?
How to start? I mean, I started with the data, the open data available about weather and climate in the US. So there's so much rich data that, you know, you don't have to be a data journalist. You can seek help from these networks to, you know, find stories for your publication. The hardest part for me continues to be solving for news avoidance around this topic and others, but especially this topic. How do we get audiences into this in a way that they stick with it? So for me, that's the hardest part I still am solving for and testing toward. But, you know, just publishing stories, learning from that audience feedback and from our newsrooms of what's hard for them. Thanks for that question. It's a really thoughtful one.
So to start, I also agree with with Jessica and Catherine about that. I would add that apply for everything. No, it's true. I mean, like, there's so many fellowships, so many opportunities for grants. I had this opportunity to start like that. I was like, okay, let me try this. And I'm saying this because it is important, although there is some skepticism about the kind of a multilateral agenda. It's very important to go to these conferences. It's boring when you do so many times, but when you're starting, it's so important to be in the biodiversity conference, in the climate conference, and because everybody goes there. that's the truth. So you make a lot of sources, you understand the kind of the major issues. So I do think there's a great value on though the kind of the hot coverage, like the hot topics. So that's how I would suggest to start. I think the hard parts are not just one, but many, like to persist, especially if you're trying to create something that is your website or something. So there's a lot of other issues that we'll have to deal with, right, Yao, who has leading a website in Malaysia is like now the funding, now the team. So there's other things that are beyond the coverage itself. But in a more conceptual level, I think the challenge for many journalists is to not become cynical about this issue, because it's going to be a big issue, it's going to last for a long time, and there's a lot of people doing like greenwashing and trying to, like not give the hard news, and you cannot give up of giving like the hard facts and keep covering and bringing the solutions as well. I think that one of the hardest part for us is telling a different story. Like, what are the alternatives for the root of the problem that we have now?
Yeah.
We do stories that really goes onto this. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not seeing many actually.
Thank you guys for sharing that. Before I open up for questions, I just want to take a second also to acknowledge my incredible team that runs the Oxford Climate Network, Diego Ortiz and Catherine Dunn. Give the audience a wave. They're around this evening. If you applied and you didn't get through, hassle them. They give me a hard time, but I love them because they push back so hard on what is really, really vital for the network. So let's open up for questions. Raise your hand. We'll try and get you a mic and get your question going.
Yeah. By the way, I've been rejected 2 times for this, but I'm gonna try.
I love you.
And the question refers to that. I mean, I'm speaking as a rookie climate journalist, and I wanted to ask about some advice, because when I got some ideas to do big investigative projects, I feel sometimes that I'm not good at it, because it's very challenging sometimes. Like get the funds, also because sometimes you have to be a known journalist that has some publication before to get some European grants or international grants. So what would you recommend about it? Where to start to become an investigative journalist?
I think, sorry, I missed your name, but I think that we'll repeat a little bit of what I believe really is thinking about these layers, like of trying to get a local context, getting the data. Like I'm doing like this because I really think like layers, like field work, data journalism, and then the network, like the collaboration. I think if you put these things together, it might work. And the collaboration also works not only on figuring out the questions, but figuring out the funds for the story. So sometimes another outlets will bring more funds, will bring resources, will bring the data visualization. So I would find good partners on the collaboration side. I would plan some really rigorous field work where I'm going to visit, who I'm going to talk to, and then I would look at the data and how am I going to bring this bigger scientific context to the story. So that's how I think we are doing in this network, is like combining these 3 things.
Did you have a question?
Yes, another question here. So just to give you a cheerful note, don't give up. I was rejected 2 times before I got into the network, so don't give up. But I would like to go back to what Jessica was talking about in the news avoidance aspect of the difficult part of reporting on this. So the role of networks in reporting is awesome, is amazing to see newsrooms collaborating, freelance journalists who meet in networks like the Oxford Network, collaborating. But then I want to hear from you guys if you have any examples to cheer us up also of collaborative work that you did that really resonated with the audience, that people really got engaged in discussing, in sharing on social media, that really had an impact.
Well, what the story is about is not cheerful. But our investigations data team did a really great piece on a big flooding threat in the Oklahoma City area, and collaborated with that local newsroom and got to, that story wouldn't have been possible by USA Today alone. And so that collaboration between those two newsrooms within our network was really important. So, the key findings of that reporting, were more doom and gloom level, but it was really important because it had the local voices, it had the faces of people, and I think that's where in the first layer of news avoidance is, can you make it real? And I said that before, but our network leveraging that to find, how do we make this real to people? The fantastic data, journalists and investigations team at USA Today, gave the heft and the context that local newsroom could, they could never do that on their own in the time frame they did the reporting. So for our internal network, kind of a downer story, but as most of these are tough. I would love to hear if there are any of you that have done any solutions, but if you have examples of solutions ones, that would be great to hear.
I mean, not a specific story per se, but there was a recent survey done on Austrian, media consumers, and it turned out that 68% said they wanted much more climate reporting. And 35% said, what is covered right now is, I need much more. So there is an audience for this. And I think I have a science background, and I was more of the science side, but I feel like there's a climate story in everything. And it's not so much just having, these are very important as well to have the classic stories on disasters and communities, etc. But it's just having this thought in every story you do makes all the difference as well, I think.
So I can sort of buttress that, not in terms of a specific story, but data. Last year, Reuters did research across 8 countries, including the US, UK, India, Pakistan, led by my colleague Waqas Ijaz, and I was part of that as well. 2 things struck us. One, that audiences across these countries trusted scientists the most. It wasn't about the hokey-pokey bits, not even in countries like the US, where climate can be quite a polarizing topic. That was one reason for hope. And the other, the fact that they often felt a bit overwhelmed with the bad news, so they were looking to journalists and newsrooms to contextualize things. Why is this a big deal? Where does this fit in? How should I process this, and what can I do about it? I think that, just as Gustavo said, that gives us a lot of hope, because that gives us the chance to do something about how we communicate. I hope that's useful.
Hello, is there time for one more?
I think there is.
Okay.
Go on.
Thank you so much for this. Gustavo, I really liked what you said about integrating the lived experience and the data. I think that's a really important part of covering climate, and I think the data analysis gives the journalists more time to focus on the lived experience. I'm a solutions journalism trainer that's done work with the environment, and I know there's other people here that also do that, so I'm wondering, what are the challenges that you face when you're covering solutions? And I'm also wondering if you have examples of community engagement with the people that you are covering. How do you follow up and make sure that the people you are covering are also getting the benefit of the analysis that you're doing?
So the example that I would like to share, it's one of very interesting. There's one thing that it happens at the Pulitzer Center, without trying to be really propagandistic here. That is the what happens after the story. So they're growing more and more the team that works around finding other audiences, because as we know, more and more there are limited audience that goes in the website or going to read the newspaper. So they're thinking how can we act for some people that are not in these platforms to see the stories. So the example that I want to share is about communities of young professionals, middle class in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they're organizing meetups of like lawyers, engineers, not journalists, and taking some of the stories for discussion. And why is that? Because right now DRC is in a crossroads of development. The government just announced that they want to do like massive auctions for oil concessions in the rainforests. And of course, this is a big issue for, for the society. Is like, are we going to lose our rainforest, but we need to develop? So they're taking these discussions into groups and doing like radio programs where people talk about it. So it's super interesting because then the solution is not about like coming with a magic solution, but everybody's kind of engaged on discussing what is the development of the country. So I find this fascinating. And the discussions are based on real investigations that are showing the problems of these projects. So I found this fascinating. And about taking some of this information directly to the people that we are sometimes talking to, or the sources. I've been seeing a lot of interesting projects in the Amazon region where stories are transforming to WhatsApp or other formats to get, because it's a real thing about the connection. A lot of the indigenous territories in Colombia, Brazil, and Peru are dealing with information via WhatsApp, so that becomes, or like transforming into radio bills for distributing through WhatsApp as well, to make sure that people receive the stories that they were part of.
Thank you guys very much for that. I just want to close with, a quick story about someone who was part of the Oxford Climate Network and is now in Oxford working on a 3-month project. His name is Radhesham Yadav. He comes from the western part of India, Maharashtra, that's been witness to both acute drought and severe floods. Radhesham is working on a solution-based project around the importance of women farmers and how they're supporting each other in western Maharashtra. And the reason he chose to do that was when he was a young boy, he saw his mother do the bulk of the farming work in the community that he lived in. And they saw floods happen pretty much on a repetitive cycle. And at the time when he was old enough to comprehend what was happening, he would see the floodwaters rushing into his hut. And the first thing his mother would do was pick up his school bag and ensure that that was put at a height that was high enough to not be impacted. I think it's when he saw the power of what was happening with climate. It's when he saw the power of what he could do with his pen as a journalist, and he decided to route that towards solution journalism. These are big wins for me. I don't know whether they tick off a mark in this conversation, but I think that's what community can do. So more power to everyone who's practicing it, and a big round of applause for this fantastic panel today. Thank you all very much.